The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty road that wound like a snake through the desolate plains. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and sagebrush, a familiar perfume to those who had lived on these lands all their lives. The widow rode slowly, her wagon creaking with every step of the mules beneath it. She was tall, her back straight despite the weight of recent years, and her face carried the quiet strength of someone who had learned to survive when the world offered little mercy. Her 2 daughters sat beside her, their eyes wide with both curiosity and caution as they scanned the horizon for any sign of trouble. Life on the prairie was never easy, and the woman had learned early that caution was often the difference between survival and disaster. She tightened the reins, her fingers stiff from the chill of the morning air, when something unusual caught her attention. A figure lay sprawled across the road, motionless, half covered in dust and the faint crimson of blood. Her heart thumped in her chest, a mixture of fear and instinct driving her forward. She knew well enough that strangers in the wilderness were often trouble, yet the sight of a wounded man stirred a deeper sense of duty she could not ignore. The daughters whispered behind her, hesitant but obedient, their small hands gripping the sides of the wagon as their mother nudged the animals onward. The closer they came, the clearer it became that the man was not merely injured. He was barely conscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. His clothing, torn and caked with dirt, suggested he had been in a fight or ambushed on the road. She dismounted carefully, brushing the dust from her skirts, and knelt beside him. There was a strange calm in his features, a stoicism that belied the injuries he carried. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and though his eyes were closed, she could sense a sharp awareness lingering beneath the surface. "Mother," one of her daughters whispered, her voice trembling. "Should we?" "We help him," the widow said firmly, her gaze steady. "We cannot leave anyone to die out here, no matter who he is." The girls exchanged worried glances, but did as they were told, fetching water from the wagon and offering it to him. His lips parted slightly, a shallow rasp, as if tasting the world without truly seeing it. She wiped the sweat and blood from his brow, noting the cuts along his arms and the deep gash across his shoulder. He flinched, not from fear, but from pain, and she pressed a clean cloth to the wound, murmuring words of comfort. The children hovered close, instinctively protective, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they did not fully understand it. There was a tension in the air, a quiet suspense that wrapped around them like a cloak. The widow knew that danger often came in unexpected forms on these plains, and yet there was something about this man that made her hesitate. Not fear, exactly, but caution, the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Still, the wounded stranger had no weapon drawn, no hostile expression. He was simply alive and in need, and that alone demanded aid. Carefully, she helped him onto the wagon, wrapping him in blankets and positioning him so that he could rest without aggravating his injuries. The daughters assisted as best they could, their small hands steady despite the tension that hummed in the morning air. The journey onward was slow, the mules straining against the load, but the widow felt a strange resolve settle over her. She would get him to her home, tend to his wounds, and perhaps learn who he was when he had the strength to speak. As they moved along the lonely road, she stole glances at him from the corner of her eye. His face was pale, his features strong and angular, yet there was a wildness in the set of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. She did not know it, but the man lying unconscious before her was not just any traveler. He carried a reputation that would send shivers through even the bravest of men, a shadowed name whispered in fear along the trails of the West. The most feared Apache warrior had been brought low by some unseen force, and now he was in the care of a widow and her daughters, unaware of the storm that his presence could bring. The afternoon sun climbed higher, warming the dusty earth and bringing with it a stillness that made every sound seem amplified. The wind carried distant calls of birds, the faint clatter of hooves, and a whisper of grass against the wagon wheels. Every so often, the stranger shifted, a low groan escaping his lips, and she would pause to adjust his blankets or offer water. There was a strange rhythm to the care she provided, a quiet intimacy born of necessity and instinct. She had never known this man, yet she felt the weight of responsibility settle like a stone in her chest. Her daughters, though young, were alert to the subtleties of their surroundings. One of them, with hair the color of autumn wheat, leaned close to her mother and whispered questions about the man's injuries, about why he might be traveling alone. The widow answered as best she could, but she admitted her uncertainty, telling them that sometimes people crossed paths with fate for reasons beyond understanding. The girl nodded solemnly, her small face shadowed by worry and curiosity, and the other daughter reached over to offer a hand to the stranger, her gentle touch a quiet prayer for his safety. By the time the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the plains, they were nearing the edge of the widow's land. The house, a sturdy but humble structure of weathered wood, rose from the horizon like a promise of shelter and safety. Smoke curled from the chimney, a signal of warmth and comfort within, and yet the widow could not shake the unease that lingered at the back of her mind. Something about the man's presence felt heavier than mere injury, as though he carried with him the weight of histories she could not see and dangers she could not name. She guided the wagon carefully up the slope to the house, the mule slipping slightly on the dry dirt, and helped the stranger down with a strength born of habit and necessity. Inside, the girls busied themselves with blankets and water, their small hands working to create a space of care and security. The widow inspected his injuries again, her fingers skilled from years of tending to the sick and wounded, and applied salves and bandages with methodical precision. The man stirred again, his eyes fluttering open, revealing dark irises that seemed to pierce the room with quiet intensity. "Who?" he rasped, his voice low and rough, yet carrying a resonance that made her pause. She met his gaze steadily, sensing a deep intelligence and an unspoken strength beneath the surface. "You're safe here," she said firmly, though her heart still beat with unease. "We'll take care of you until you can move again." He nodded slowly, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a wariness that suggested experience with betrayal and conflict. The girls hovered close, their small figures framed by the warm glow of the hearth, and the widow could not help but feel a mix of relief and apprehension. They had acted out of instinct and compassion, yet she knew that the world beyond their homestead was not so forgiving. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, the wind carrying whispers of distant events that the family could not yet comprehend. Somewhere along the trails, stories of the feared Apache had spread like wildfire, and now, unknown to them, the man who had haunted the edges of settlements and travelers' tailies was lying quietly in a small room, tended by a widow and her children. The collision of fates was delicate, a fragile thread holding back storms of consequence that none of them were prepared to face. As night fell, the widow and her daughters prepared a simple supper, the warmth of the fire contrasting with the tension that still lingered in the room. The man slept fitfully, his brow furrowed, his body twisting in response to dreams perhaps of battles fought and lives lost. She watched him for a long time, her mind restless with questions about who he was and why fate had placed him on their path. The wind outside howled through the gaps in the wooden walls, a reminder that the world beyond their home was wide and unforgiving, and that this moment of care and quiet could not erase the dangers that lay ahead. When the girls were finally tucked into bed, the widow lingered near the fireplace, her thoughts circling like the smoke rising from the hearth. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, nor the challenges that would come with harboring a man whose very name inspired fear. Yet there was a strange determination that had settled within her, a resolve to see this through, to face whatever consequences might arise from an act of compassion. The man stirred again, murmuring words she could not understand, and the widow could only watch, a sense of foreboding gnawing at the edges of her heart. She sensed that the quiet night was a fragile thing, a thin veil over a coming storm that none of them could yet imagine. Outside, the plains were dark and empty, yet full of secrets, and somewhere in the distance, the whisper of danger crept closer with every passing hour. And so the night settled over the homestead, the widow and her daughters unaware that the man they had rescued was no ordinary traveler. He was a shadow of fear and legend, a force whose arrival could change the course of their lives forever. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come. And within the small, humble home, the three women waited, hearts steady but minds alert, for the dawn that would bring answers and perhaps peril beyond their imagining. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, brushing the wooden floor with pale gold. The widow was already awake, tending to chores that had become second nature over the years, feeding the chickens, stirring the coals in the stove, and listening to the quiet sounds of her home. Her daughters still slept, their breaths even and soft, unaware of the weight that had settled in the room overnight. She paused for a moment, glancing toward the stranger lying on the cot near the hearth. His chest rose and fell steadily now, the color returning to his face in uneven waves. The bandages were damp with antiseptic, his wounds slowly knitting shut, yet there was still an unspoken tension that clung to him like a shadow. He had not spoken since they had brought him in. Not a word, not even a sigh that could be understood. The widow had tried to ask his name, to offer comfort, but he only gave a faint nod or a grimace when she adjusted his blankets. There was a quiet dignity in his stillness, a subtle pride that seemed as much a part of him as the injuries he carried. She could see that he was wary, each movement measured, as if he were always ready to spring into action. It was a caution that spoke of battles fought, of enemies that could appear without warning. She did not yet know the full weight of the legend that surrounded him, but she felt the pull of it in her bones, a sense that this man's life was not like any they had known. The daughters appeared suddenly, rubbing their eyes and stretching. The younger one clutched a small doll to her chest, her gaze flitting nervously toward the cot. The elder, more curious than timid, stepped forward and whispered questions about the stranger's injuries. The widow gave them measured answers, careful to maintain calm while silently acknowledging the dangerous truth that lay beneath his quiet suffering. She did not want them frightened, but she could not erase the instinctive feeling of caution that had lodged itself firmly in her mind. By mid-morning, the stranger had shifted enough to sit upright, leaning on his elbows. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the room as if mapping it in an instant. There was intelligence there, a keen observation that made the widow pause. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough from disuse, yet carried an authority that demanded attention. "I owe you my life," he said, his words deliberate, careful. "Why?" The widow hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Because it is right," she said finally. "No one should die alone on the road." He studied her face for a long moment, his gaze unreadable, and then inclined his head slightly. There was a flicker of acknowledgment, but nothing more. It was as if the act of saving him had created a debt that neither of them fully understood yet. Over the next few days, the house settled into a quiet rhythm. The stranger remained mostly silent, observing and listening more than speaking. The widow tended to his wounds with methodical care, bringing him water and food, helping him to regain strength without asking questions he was not ready to answer. The daughters, naturally curious, hovered near him, their questions growing bolder each day. They wanted to know where he had come from, why he had been injured, and whether he would stay with them. The widow responded with gentle deflection, knowing that answers, when they came, could carry more danger than they could imagine. Despite his quiet, there were moments when the stranger's presence unsettled the household. The way he scanned the horizon, the way his hands twitched at unexpected sounds, the tension in his posture all suggested that he was accustomed to a world far harsher than their small homestead. At night, The wind through the cracks in the walls seemed to whisper warnings, carrying with it a sense of peril that she could not fully name. She found herself checking the doors more carefully, listening for every sound, and feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and fascination whenever he stirred. One afternoon, as the sun blazed high and the heat shimmered off the plains, the stranger finally allowed himself to speak more freely. He told them fragments of his journey, an ambush by rival men, a desperate escape, and a pursuit that had left him wounded and exhausted. The widow listened carefully, piecing together a story that hinted at a life of hardship and conflict. He spoke sparingly, his words measured and deliberate, each sentence hinting at dangers that had shaped him, yet leaving out the full details that might reveal the fear his name inspired. The daughters were captivated, hanging on every word, their imaginations filling in the gaps with visions of adventure and bravery. The widow, however, felt the weight of reality pressing against the edges of the story. She understood that this man was not merely a traveler. He was a survivor of countless encounters that few could endure. There was a quiet intensity about him, a strength born of necessity, and she could sense that the shadows of his past were never far from his mind. As the days passed, the stranger began to move more freely about the house, his strength returning slowly. He helped with chores when he could, carrying firewood or tending to the small garden, though his movements were always cautious, as if he were calculating the world in real time. The widow watched him closely, noting the precision in his actions, the patience that seemed to govern every motion. There was a grace in him that spoke of survival instincts honed over years, a skill set that could mean the difference between life and death in a single moment. Despite the routine, there was an undercurrent of tension that the widow could not shake. She felt it in the way the stranger's eyes sometimes darkened when he heard distant noises, in the way he tensed when shadows moved across the walls, and in the way he seemed to measure every step she took. She understood that he had lived in a world where trust was rare and betrayal constant, and she respected the caution he carried. Yet she could not ignore the feeling that their fates were now intertwined, that the choice to save him had drawn them into a story far larger than their own quiet lives. One evening, as twilight settled over the plains and the sky bled shades of amber and violet, the stranger stood outside the house, gazing across the horizon. The wind tugged at his hair and clothes, carrying with it the distant cries of animals and the faint echo of human voices far away. The widow approached him quietly, sensing that he was lost in thought, wrestling with memories he could not yet voice. "You can't stay out here forever," she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned to her, his expression unreadable, and nodded. "I know," he said, "but some paths do not end easily." She sensed that he spoke not only of his journey, but of a life shaped by conflict and duty, one that could not simply be set aside, even in the quiet safety of their home. There was a weight in his eyes, a burden of responsibility and survival that she could barely comprehend, yet she felt it pressing against the edges of her own world. That night, the wind rose stronger, rattling the shutters and carrying the scent of dust and distant fires. The daughters slept fitfully, stirred by dreams of unknown threats, while the widow sat by the fire, watching the stranger who now lay on a cot near the hearth. He was restless, muttering in a language she did not understand, and she realized that his past was far from behind him. There were shadows that followed him, forces that might find their way to this quiet homestead, and she knew that her act of compassion had placed them all in the path of something larger than themselves. The following morning, a rider appeared on the distant ridge, a lone figure silhouetted against the rising sun. The widow spotted him first, squinting against the light, and felt a chill creep down her spine. The stranger was already alert, moving with a swiftness that belied his still healing injuries. He crouched low, scanning the horizon, and the widow realized that whatever news this rider carried could bring change and danger in equal measure. The girls pressed close, sensing the shift in the air, and the widow felt a knot tighten in her chest. The rider did not approach immediately, instead pausing to watch the house from a distance. The stranger's hand rested near the blade at his side, and his posture was tense, every muscle coiled as if ready to strike. He had not told her of the enemies who sought him, the rival factions and men who had learned to fear his name. Yet now their presence was undeniable, a reminder that the plains were never truly safe. "Mother," the elder daughter whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "who is he, really?" The widow did not answer immediately. She had only fragments of the truth, and she understood that revealing them could change everything. "We will learn soon enough," she said finally, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "But for now, we must be careful." The stranger moved to the window, his eyes narrowed, following the rider's every motion. His jaw tightened, and there was a brief flash of something fierce, almost dangerous, that the widow had not yet seen. She realized then that the man they had saved was more than just injured and weary. He was a force to be reckoned with, a presence that could alter the balance of safety and danger in their lives in an instant. The rider's gaze lingered on the house, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled, the plains quieted, and the tension between the quiet homestead and the approaching figure grew almost unbearable. The daughters clung to their mother, their small hands gripping her skirts, and the widow felt the weight of every choice she had made pressing down upon her. They had acted out of compassion, yet the consequences of that act were still unknown, and the stranger, their silent guardian, seemed poised on the edge of action, ready to face whatever might come. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist, and the rider began to move again, slowly descending the slope toward the house. The widow could see the stranger's eyes track him with a precision born of years of survival. She knew then that the calm they had built within these walls was fragile, that the quiet safety of their home could be shattered at any moment. And yet, despite the danger, there was a strange hope in her chest, a belief that they could face what was coming together, even if the path ahead was uncertain and perilous. The rider paused once more, now within sight of the homestead. The stranger tensed visibly, every movement controlled, every sense alert. The widow held her breath, the daughters pressed close, and the silence stretched taut, like a bowstring pulled to its limit. In that suspended moment, the story of their lives, the quiet routine of survival, the act of compassion, and the arrival of a man marked by legend hung in balance. What would come next, they could not yet know, but the threads of fate had been set, and the plains held their secrets tightly, waiting for the story to unfold. The sun had climbed high over the plains, turning the horizon into a shimmering line of golden heat. Inside the house, the widow moved quietly, preparing the midday meal, though her hand shook slightly as she chopped vegetables. The stranger, now resting in a chair by the hearth, remained unusually still, his dark eyes focused on the window as if he could see things far beyond the empty fields. His presence filled the room with a silent tension, one that the widow could neither dismiss nor fully understand. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, and every sound outside, the wind through the trees, the faint creak of the wagon wheels in the yard, made her pause. Her daughters watched him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The younger one, more sensitive to the undercurrent of danger, stayed close to her mother's side, clinging to her skirts. The elder daughter, fascinated by the stranger's quiet intensity, lingered near the doorway, her eyes tracing the lines of his face and the scars along his arms. She asked questions in whispers, pressing for details he could not yet offer, and the widow answered cautiously, careful to protect them without lying outright. The rider from the ridge had not yet appeared, but the widow felt the weight of his presence in the air, as if the plains themselves were holding their breath. She sensed that the world outside was shifting, that the quiet homestead could no longer remain untouched by the currents of fear and conflict that followed the stranger. Every instinct she had told her that the moment of calm was temporary, and yet she forced herself to continue the small rituals of domestic life, watering the plants, checking the animals and keeping the fire stoked. The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "They will come," he said, almost as if confirming something the widow already knew. "Sooner than you think." The widow nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "We will be ready," she said, though her heart pounded. She did not know what ready meant in a situation like this. She did not know how much danger would arrive with the rider or what other forces were already moving toward them. She only knew that the man they had rescued carried a past as perilous as the open plains themselves. The daughters sat together on the floor, whispering in hushed tones about the stranger. The elder daughter, emboldened by curiosity, asked questions about why he seemed so wary, why his gaze was always scanning, always measuring. The widow reminded her that some things are not meant to be known until the time is right, that some dangers cannot be explained to young ears. Yet she could not deny the truth behind her own words. The stranger's past was a shadow that would reach into their lives sooner or later, and they could feel its pull even now. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hoofbeats. The widow stiffened, moving instinctively toward the window, while the stranger rose smoothly to his feet. His movements were precise, controlled, as though each step had been calculated to conserve strength while remaining ready for action. The girls froze, sensing the tension in the room. The widow's hand brushed against the edge of the table, her fingers tightening as she held herself in check. The rider appeared once more, now closer, his silhouette etched sharply against the golden plains. He did not call out, nor did he signal in any way. It was clear he had been sent to observe, to gather information, and the widow understood that his intentions were likely far from benign. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and she could see the faintest flicker of anger and determination cross his face. There was a history between them, one she did not yet know, and it carried the weight of past encounters and untold danger. The stranger moved to the door, not opening it, but positioning himself to gauge the rider's next action. "He is alone," he muttered, almost to himself. "And he carries a message." The widow realized that the words were loaded with meaning. The man they had saved was not merely a survivor of random attacks. He was a figure whose name carried power, a man whose enemies had reasons beyond personal grievance to seek him. She felt a chill pass over her, a sense that the act of helping him had entangled them in a larger story, one that would test courage, loyalty, and survival in ways she could not yet imagine. Hours passed in tense stillness. The rider made small movements along the ridge, sometimes disappearing behind a rise only to reappear moments later. The stranger remained alert, pacing carefully inside, his hand brushing near the small knife at his side. He spoke little, conserving his energy, yet every glance out the window, every measured step he took, told the widow that he was calculating, planning, waiting for the right moment. The afternoon sun dipped lower, and the shadow of the house grew long across the dry earth. The widow began preparing for the possibility that the rider might descend, gathering whatever weapons she could find, old pistols, hunting knives, even sturdy sticks to ward off intruders. She did this quietly, not wanting to alarm the daughters, who were now clinging together in fear. The stranger watched her work with silent approval, recognizing the instincts of someone who had lived through hardship and understood the need for preparation. As twilight fell, the stranger finally shared more of his story, not in full, but in fragments that hinted at the depth of the conflict he carried with him. He spoke of rival bands, of men who had feared his name and sought revenge, of skirmishes along the trails where he had survived against impossible odds. He did not boast, nor did he seek sympathy. His words were matter of fact, almost detached, yet they painted a picture of a life that had been shaped by constant danger and unrelenting vigilance. The widow listened, absorbing the story with a mixture of awe and fear. She realized that the man lying in her home was not only skilled but bound by honor and necessity to forces that could reach them even here in the quiet of the plains. The daughters, though young, began to understand in their own way that they had been brought into a story much larger than themselves, one in which courage and quick thinking could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Night fell fully over the homestead, and the wind carried with it distant sounds that neither the widow nor the stranger could ignore. An owl called somewhere beyond the trees, a coyote yipped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of brush suggested that they were not alone. The stranger moved to the window again, studying the darkness, while the widow lit a few lanterns inside, creating pockets of warmth and light. The daughters slept uneasily, dreams troubled by shadows and distant cries. The widow remained by the fire, listening to the stranger as he recounted more of his journey, each detail revealing a different angle of the danger that followed him. She began to understand the complexity of his past, not merely a single threat, but layers of conflict and tension, rivalries that spanned distances and years. She also saw a sense of loneliness in him, a man who had endured hardships few could imagine, whose trust had been earned through survival and vigilance. The stranger spoke again, this time of choices made in desperation, of alliances formed and broken, and of moments where survival had required difficult decisions. The widow realized that the moral weight of his life was heavy, yet he carried it with quiet dignity. There was a code in him, a set of principles that governed action even in chaos, and she understood that this code would guide the decisions he would soon have to make, decisions that could drag them all into danger. Suddenly, the sound of distant voices carried on the wind. The widow froze, glancing at the stranger, whose body tensed instantly. "They are close," he whispered. "Closer than I thought." The rider on the ridge had not come alone, or perhaps the rider had sent word to others. The plains seemed to hold their breath, the wind stilling for a moment as if waiting to see what would happen next. The widow felt the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. She had acted out of compassion, and now that choice had pulled her, her daughters, and her home into a network of danger and conflict that she barely understood. The stranger moved with silent precision, checking doors and windows, positioning himself near the hearth where he could quickly defend the family if needed. He did not panic, did not raise his voice. His presence was calm, controlled, yet every movement carried the tension of a man accustomed to life and death stakes. The widow admired his skill, but she also felt a rising fear, an understanding that their quiet life could be shattered in an instant. The night stretched on, filled with shadows and distant sounds. The widow, the daughters, and the stranger waited, listening, watching, their senses sharpened by anticipation. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the trees suggested movement beyond the homestead. Every second that passed carried the possibility of confrontation, of revelation, of danger that could reach inside the home. Within the quiet, the widow realized that the stranger's presence was more than protection. It was a living reminder that the world outside their small house was unforgiving, that acts of kindness could draw unexpected consequences, and that courage often required vigilance and quick thinking. The daughters, though frightened, began to understand in small ways the complexity of survival, the way choices ripple outward, and the weight of responsibility that comes with helping someone in need. And so the night deepened, the wind carrying distant cries and shadows stretching across the plains. The stranger watched, the widow prepared, and the daughters clung together, hearts racing with a mixture of fear and awe. Outside, the darkness held secrets, threats, and mysteries, and inside, the fragile calm of the home balanced on the edge of a story that had only just begun. No one knew what would come next, nor what forces were moving toward them. The stranger's past lingered like smoke over the plains, unspoken but palpable, and the widow felt the weight of every choice they had made pressing against her chest. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the rider waited, and with him, the unknown threads of conflict that would soon test the courage, loyalty, and survival of all who dwelled in the quiet homestead. The night pressed heavily against the homestead. the wind rising with a keening that rattled the shutters and tossed dry leaves across the yard. The widow had kept the lanterns low, their dim glow barely illuminating the worn wooden walls, while her daughters huddled close on the floor, their small hands clutching each other, whispering prayers they barely understood. The stranger stood near the window again, his dark eyes scanning the horizon, every muscle taut with the awareness of dangers unseen. His breathing was slow but deliberate, a rhythm honed from years of survival and necessity, and the widow watched him with both admiration and unease. Outside, the plains were silent except for the whispering wind, yet the faint outline of movement suggested that the rider and others were still out there, circling, watching, waiting. The widow knew that the calm they had counted on was fragile. Every shadow, every distant sound, could signal the approach of those who carried threats not yet fully revealed. The stranger, sensing the tension in the air, moved like a predator and protector at once, every step calculated, every gesture deliberate. The widow felt the invisible weight of his vigilance pressing over her shoulders, a mixture of reassurance and fear. The daughters whispered questions that went unanswered, curiosity mingling with fright. The elder one asked why the stranger did not simply leave, why he risked staying with them if enemies pursued him. The widow gave careful answers, her voice calm but measured. "Some people cannot walk away," she said softly. "Sometimes helping them is the only choice we have, even when danger follows." She watched the stranger as he adjusted his position near the door, his hand resting lightly on the handle of the knife at his belt. There was a quiet intensity in him that both terrified and fascinated the girls. Hours passed with tense stillness. Every small sound seemed amplified, the wind against the walls, the soft creak of the floorboards, even the faint scurrying of mice. The widow tried to maintain the normal rhythms of the home, preparing a modest meal, tending to the fire. Yet she felt the undercurrent of anticipation pressing closer with each passing moment. She could see the stranger's mind working as he moved through the house, checking locks, surveying the horizon from the window, silently preparing for whatever threat would arrive first. When the sound of hooves finally reached the edge of the property, the widow felt a sharp jolt of fear mixed with determination. The stranger's eyes darkened, and she realized that he recognized every subtle signal of danger, every slight movement that suggested more than mere curiosity from the rider outside. "They are coming closer," he whispered, barely moving his lips, yet the weight of his words settled in the room like a stone. "And this time, they will not leave without conflict." The widow felt her heart pound, her pulse quickening as the realization sank in. The act of saving this man had entwined their lives with a force beyond their comprehension, one that had followed him across plains and settlements and now threatened to breach the fragile safety of their home. Her daughters clung closer to her, their breaths shallow, and she wrapped her arms around them, offering comfort even as her own fear rippled beneath the surface. The wind shifted again, carrying distant shouts, the unmistakable sound of men on horseback moving through the brush. The stranger moved to the door, checking the lock, listening, and finally nodding once to himself. "They do not know yet what waits for them," he muttered, his voice low but edged with grim certainty. There was a confidence in him, born of countless encounters, that made the widow both relieved and apprehensive. She understood that their safety now depended on the stranger and on his ability to confront dangers that none of them could yet face. Suddenly, a shadow appeared against the faint glow of the horizon, a lone figure approaching the house, mounted and cautious, clearly attempting to assess the homestead without drawing attention. The stranger moved with lightning precision, positioning himself so that he could observe without being seen. His eyes tracked the rider's every move, reading intent, measuring distance, predicting actions before they occurred. The widow watched in awe, understanding for the first time why this man's name carried weight beyond ordinary fear. He was not only skilled. He was meticulous, every instinct honed to survival and strategy. The rider halted briefly, scanning the homestead, and then dismounted, moving silently across the yard. The stranger followed his movements closely, a low murmur of warning escaping his lips, almost unnoticed by the widow. She clutched her daughters closer, feeling the tension in her chest tighten with every passing second. Outside, the rider crouched near a fence post, peering toward the window where the stranger stood, and it became clear that this was no ordinary visitor. He carried a message, a threat, or perhaps both, and the widow realized that their simple act of compassion had drawn them into a storm far larger than they could imagine. The stranger finally broke the silence. "Do not leave your rooms," he said softly, almost a whisper. "Stay quiet, stay low. If they see you, it will change everything." His voice carried a calm authority that left no room for argument. The widow obeyed without hesitation, retreating with her daughters into the furthest corner of the house, the door closing softly behind them. Every sense was heightened. Every creak, every whisper of the wind felt like a signal of impending conflict. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The rider outside moved cautiously, testing the ground, peering into the windows, and the stranger's hand brushed against the hilt of his knife repeatedly, ready for action. The widow could see his muscles tense and relax in a rhythm that suggested long experience in such moments. Her daughters held their breath, eyes wide, and she whispered encouragement, trying to maintain calm even as her own nerves frayed. Suddenly, a second rider appeared, moving silently along the ridge, a shadow within a shadow, unseen by the first. The stranger's gaze flicked toward the movement, and his posture tightened. He moved with speed and quiet precision to the back of the house, signaling the widow and her daughters to remain perfectly still. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of horses and dust, and the quiet homestead seemed to hold its breath. The first rider, closer now, crouched low and moved deliberately toward the door, testing locks and peering through windows. The stranger observed, calculating the optimal moment to act, every heartbeat measured and deliberate. He spoke barely above a whisper to the widow. When they reached the door, "Do not move. Trust me." The widow nodded, fear and trust intertwining in her chest, while the daughters pressed closer together, their small hands gripping each other. The tension mounted with every second. The stranger had always been quiet, almost invisible, yet in this moment he carried the weight of survival for all three of them. The widow realized that the lives of her daughters, her home, and even herself depended entirely on his skill, his judgment, and the strength he carried quietly within him. Outside, the shadows shifted again, and the wind carried faint sounds of murmured words, the planning of intruders unaware that their prey was far more prepared than they imagined. The stranger moved to the door silently, listening to the approach of the first rider. His movements were almost imperceptible, a blur to anyone who might glance, and yet every step was precise, every action deliberate. The widow held her breath, feeling the weight of anticipation pressing down, as if the night itself had become a living thing, tense and ready to snap. A sudden sound, a branch snapping underfoot, made the daughters flinch, and the stranger's head snapped toward the window, his eyes narrowing. The rider froze as well, realizing too late that he had been detected, even if only partially. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and danger, and the moment seemed suspended, stretched taut between action and consequence. The widow felt her pulse thrum in her ears, a rapid beat of fear and hope entwined. The stranger's hand moved to the hilt of his knife, his body coiled with energy, ready to act at the first sign of aggression. The riders outside hesitated, sensing something they could not fully understand, a presence more powerful and controlled than anything they had anticipated. The widow whispered softly to her daughters, "Stay still, no matter what you hear." The girls obeyed, their eyes wide and fixed on the stranger, who now seemed like the axis around which the world had turned in this moment of suspended peril. The wind carried a faint murmur of voices, close but not yet inside. The stranger's gaze flicked from window to ridge to doorway, calculating every possible outcome, every possible threat. The widow felt a mixture of awe and terror. She understood, in this heartbeat of tension, that the stranger's skills, his instincts, and his courage were the thin line separating them from disaster. Time seemed to stretch, the night stretching like a drawn bow, until finally the faintest shift indicated that the riders were choosing their moment, that the next seconds could bring confrontation. The widow pressed her daughters close, feeling the tension in every fiber of her being, and the stranger, quiet and poised, prepared to act. The plains outside were dark, yet full of unseen eyes, unseen hands, and the promise of conflict that could erupt at any moment. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of dust and distant fire, and the widow felt the weight of every choice, every act of kindness that had brought them to this point. Outside, shadows crept closer, uncertainty thickening with each passing heartbeat, and inside, the small home held a fragile calm, poised on the edge of a story that had yet to find its resolution. The stranger's hand rested lightly on the knife again, and he whispered, almost to himself, "Soon they will see. Soon they will understand." His eyes burned with a quiet fire, a signal that he was ready for whatever force had come to test them. The widow and her daughters remained silent, held captive by tension and anticipation, as the world outside moved closer, carrying threat and unknown consequences. The night held them in its grip, the wind carrying the promise of confrontation, and the homestead became a place of waiting, a place where courage, skill, and determination would soon be tested. Every second, every rustle, every shadow built the suspense, inching closer to the moment when action would erupt, when the forces moving toward them would collide with the careful preparations and quiet strength of the stranger who had entered their lives so unexpectedly. And so the night stretched on, suspense thick and unyielding, the homestead poised at the brink of the unknown, the stranger ready, and the widow and daughters holding their breath, waiting for the moment when the tension of the plains would finally break. The first sounds of movement outside shattered the tense quiet, a flurry of hooves and shouts that carried through the night like a warning. The widow's heart thumped, and the daughters clutched each other tightly, but the stranger moved with a calm that belied the urgency. He positioned himself at the door, his knife ready, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the night holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Then, with the precision of someone who had faced life-and-death situations countless times before, he acted. The rider who had approached first was met with a swift, controlled movement, the stranger stepping out from the shadows, his presence sudden and commanding. The man froze, caught off guard by the silent intensity radiating from the one he had come to threaten. A tense pause followed, long enough for the widow and her daughters to realize that the stranger's reputation was not mere legend. Every motion, every glance, carried authority and experience, the kind that could shift the outcome of conflict without unnecessary violence. The other rider, approaching from the ridge, halted abruptly, recognizing the same thing. Their confidence faltered as the stranger's calm dominance became evident. He did not strike unless provoked, but his posture spoke of readiness, of unyielding strength honed over years of survival. The widow felt a strange pride mixed with relief. The man they had saved, the Apache who had seemed so mysterious and dangerous at first, was also their protector, his courage and skill now the thin line between safety and chaos. Voices rose, tense and wary, but the stranger remained silent, watching, waiting. The riders were forced to reconsider their actions, sensing that any rash movement could result in immediate consequences. The widow realized that the danger that had loomed over them was not entirely vanquished, but it had been held at bay through the stranger's presence alone. She gathered her daughters, whispering reassurances even as the wind carried the sound of hooves retreating. Hours passed in the aftermath of that encounter, the night still alive with tension, but the immediate threat had lessened. The stranger returned to the house, carefully checking every door and window before speaking. "They will not leave this unsettled," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But for now, we have bought time." The widow nodded, understanding that life on the plains was never completely safe, yet grateful for the moment of reprieve that had been won. In the following days, the stranger began to share more of his story, though still sparingly. He spoke of the rival bands and the dangers he had faced, of battles fought to protect those who could not defend themselves, and of the narrow escapes that had brought him here. The widow listened closely, piecing together fragments that explained the vigilance, the quiet intensity, and the unspoken weight he carried. The daughters, though still young, began to grasp the depth of the life that had brought this man to their doorstep. Their curiosity was tempered by respect and a growing understanding of courage in the face of constant threat. As the weeks passed, the homestead settled into a rhythm of cautious normalcy. The stranger helped with daily chores, his presence no longer solely a force of defense but also of care. He tended the animals, assisted with repairs, and even offered lessons to the daughters about survival on the plains, teaching them skills to match their growing awareness of the wider, more dangerous world. The widow observed him with a mix of admiration and gratitude, recognizing that their lives had been profoundly changed by the choice to offer help, and that the stranger had become more than a guest, he was part of their family. Yet shadows of the past lingered. Occasionally, signs of pursuit appeared: distant figures on horseback, tracks that suggested someone was still watching, messages left in the form of broken branches or marks along the fence line. The stranger addressed these threats quietly, handling each situation with the same calm authority, ensuring that the widow and her daughters remained safe while subtly teaching them vigilance and awareness. The lessons were not harsh. They were practical, born of necessity, and delivered with a quiet respect for the family he had come to protect. One morning, the stranger led the widow and her daughters to the top of a small rise on their land, overlooking the vast expanse of plains beyond. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of sagebrush and earth, and the horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder of both freedom and vulnerability. "The world is wide," he said, his voice low but steady, "and danger travels faster than most imagine. But courage and care can create safety, even in wild places." His words carried weight not as a lecture, but as a lesson hard-earned through experience. The daughters listened, absorbing the wisdom with eyes wide. They began to understand that life was a balance of caution and bravery, of kindness and preparedness. The widow stood beside them, feeling a sense of relief and hope. The stranger's presence had brought them not only protection, but also understanding and education in resilience that no simple life could provide. The past, with all its dangers and uncertainties, had led them to this point, and now the future held possibilities that were both promising and challenging. As the weeks turned to months, the stranger became a quiet force of stability in the household. He healed fully, not only from his injuries but from the constant strain of evading danger, finding in the widow's home a sanctuary he had not known he needed. The widow and her daughters continued their lives, strengthened by the presence of someone who had faced the world's harshest trials and returned. Trust grew, not easily but steadily, a bond formed through shared experience and mutual respect. The distant threats eventually receded. The riders and rival factions that had pursued the stranger learned that he was no ordinary target, that his skills and knowledge made interference risky and unwise. Word of his presence on the homestead quietly spread, rumors of his survival and quiet strength, ensuring that no further attacks came directly to their door. Life settled into a pattern that was not entirely free from worry, but safer, calmer, and full of the small joys that had been absent during the long months of tension. The widow found herself reflecting on the series of choices that had brought them here. Rescuing the injured stranger had been an act of instinct, compassion, and courage, and it had transformed their lives in ways she had never anticipated. She saw now that acts of kindness, even when risky, could lead to growth, connection, and protection that went far beyond what was immediately visible. The stranger, once a figure of mystery and fear, had become a part of their family, teaching lessons in bravery, resilience, and trust. The daughters grew stronger, more confident, and more aware of the complexities of life beyond the homestead. They learned skills from the stranger, from their mother, and from experience itself, developing awareness and courage that would serve them well in the years to come. The bonds between them deepened, forged in the quiet intensity of shared danger and nurtured by the steady presence of someone who had faced the world and survived. One evening, as the sun set over the plains, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, the widow and the stranger stood together outside the house, watching the horizon. The daughters played nearby, their laughter carrying across the open land, a sound of innocence and hope that seemed almost impossible given the trials of the past months. The stranger's expression softened, the tension of constant vigilance easing as he watched them, understanding that his place in this household was no longer that of an outsider but of protector, teacher, and family. "You've given me more than safety," he said quietly, his gaze on the distant horizon. "You've given me a home." The widow nodded, her eyes reflecting gratitude and understanding. "And you've given us courage," she replied. "You've shown us that even in danger, kindness and vigilance can coexist." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind carrying the sound of distant animals and the gentle murmur of life returning to normal. The homestead, once quiet and vulnerable, now felt alive, fortified not just by walls and locks, but by the bonds of trust, courage, and shared experience. Every shadow, every distant noise was still a reminder of the world beyond. But the family felt ready, together, to meet whatever might come. In the days that followed, the stranger continued to help, teach, and protect, always with calm authority and quiet kindness. The widow resumed her routines, her confidence strengthened by the knowledge that they were not alone. The daughters grew bolder, more aware, and more capable, carrying lessons learned not just in safety, but in courage, vigilance, and empathy. Life on the plains returned to a rhythm that was both simple and profound, shaped by trials endured and lessons learned. The legend of the stranger, the feared Apache, remained in whispers, carried across distant settlements, yet here, in the quiet homestead, he was no longer a figure of fear but a symbol of resilience, strength, and the transformative power of trust and compassion. The family had faced danger, uncertainty, and the unknown, yet they had emerged stronger, bonded, and hopeful for the future. As the sun rose over the horizon one final time, casting golden light across the plains, the widow, her daughters, and the stranger stood together, ready to face whatever came next, not as strangers, not as isolated individuals, but as a family strengthened by courage, guided by trust, and anchored in love. The homestead, once vulnerable and uncertain, now stood as a testament to resilience, the power of compassion, and the enduring human spirit that could weather even the harshest storms. And so, life continued, not without challenges, but with hope, connection, and a deep understanding that kindness, courage, and vigilance could change lives in ways far beyond expectation. The stranger, once an unknown traveler, had become a protector and teacher. The widow had strengthened her family through compassion and courage. And the daughters, once fearful, now thrived in a home that had endured storms and emerged stronger for it. The plains stretched endlessly around them, open and free, carrying whispers of past dangers and future possibilities. But inside the home, peace settled gently, a reward for acts of bravery and trust that had brought them to this moment. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and through it, discovered that courage and compassion could create safety, connection, and a lasting sense of home. And though the horizon beyond the homestead remained wild and unpredictable, within those walls hearts were steady, spirits resilient, and a new chapter awaited one of growth, hope, and the enduring bond forged by the trials they had endured together.